Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Let's go to Denmark and talk about disasters today, shall we? I am about to introduce you to a professor of social science at Roskilde University. And this is Professor Olivier Rubin. And he's a political scientist, and he is based at this university, Roskilde University, and he studies all kinds of slow-moving disasters. I think a volcano or an earthquake would be a fast-moving disaster. And I had always assumed that the 6 disasters that Project Save the World addressed were also fairly fast-moving, in that I contrasted them to something like poverty, which has been with us forever and ever, and probably nobody will ever say there's a moment when it all ended. How are you, Olivier?
Thanks. I'm fine, and thanks for having me, Meta. It's great.
What's the difference between a fast-moving and slow-moving? And
that there is a difference in terms of how you categorize crisis or disasters. So you can categorize crisis and disasters in many different ways, right? So categorizing them into rapid or slow onset disasters is mainly an analytical way of approaching them. It's a way of recognizing that there might be something specific about slow onset disasters, or there might be something specific about rapid onset disasters. And one of the sort of main issues or factors with slow onset disasters vis-a-vis rapid onset disasters is the attention of politicians and the public. It's often the case with slow onset disasters that it's much more difficult to get these crises or disasters on the political agenda or the public agenda.
The boiling frog, right?
The boiling frog, exactly, right?
Exactly, so that's the problem. Oh, yeah.
You can say all disasters are slow onset in the sense that there are some factors that leads up to this earthquake, right? I mean, perhaps we haven't built the buildings robust enough. Perhaps we didn't monitor the seismic waves good enough, right? So there's also always some kind of, you can say, a social science component or a human component involved in disasters. And in that way, you can say all disasters in some way are slow onset. Even a flash flood. Why did people live there? Why did they live there in these kind of shanty houses and so on? But it's a good analytical category to say, well, some disasters are really rapid. I mean, they're just in your face. They go out, they have a big bang, and then something happens. Whereas, as you rightly say, other disasters, they simmer like the frog, and the temperature is just being, increased slightly, ever so slightly each year. I mean, an obvious example would be climate change. Another example would be antimicrobial resistance, which does not, well, climate change does. I mean, but that it demands a lot of work to put climate change on the political agenda. And even when it is on the agenda, as we saw in the recent COP26, it's not always the case that politicians are really doing something about it.
I'm glad you mentioned right off the bat this antimicrobial resistance, because it strikes me as a disaster in the making, but it hasn't really hit yet. In other words, there are a few people who've died of, maybe quite a few people have died of these resistant microbes that have developed resistance to any antibiotics. But I think the real catastrophe is in the making, and we're not doing anything significant to forestall it. Is that fair to say?
We have recognized it as a threat, and actually it's estimated that 700,000 people die each year due to antimicrobial resistance. So antimicrobial resistance is this umbrella term, right? But yeah,
700,000 globally. How long has that been happening? See, I didn't know it. I would have guessed 5,000.
Yeah. And me too, before I started to research the area. In the US, it's around 25,000. In Europe, it's around 25,000. It's much more in the middle income and low income countries. But this is an estimate to 700,000. And by some estimates, it could increase to 10 million annually in 2050. But these are, I mean, so these are spread out, right? That's the first thing, right? So
okay, now let me derail you a minute. You say it's more in underdeveloped countries. I've understood that in most countries, I don't know, Asian countries and so on, you can buy antibiotics like you'd buy aspirin, that
over the counter.
There's no control and no self-control over the doctors or any other way of restricting access. Is that having more impact there than it would be having here because we do have some control over it?
Sure, it does. It has more. I mean, of course, it's a little bit of a sort of caricature that you can just buy it over the counter. But in a lot of low and middle income countries, it's much easier to get antibiotics over the counter without a prescription. If you need a prescription, it's much easier to get it. And in other countries, you get antibiotics for virus infections, for instance, because they don't have the diagnosis to sort of say what it is before they hand out the antibiotics. So that is certainly the case. Now, of course, in the US and in Europe, we have a much more sophisticated system, both in terms of human health and animal health. But of course, bacteria, they know that they don't know borders, right? So they're not showing their passport when they come to the US or to my country, Denmark, right? So it is a global problem. You can solve it to some extent by national policies, but because it is a global problem, because bacteria travel across borders, both through processed food, through travel, business travel, leisure travel, then it's very difficult to sort of isolate totally and say, well, we can just have our policies and then we don't care about the rest of the world. And that is also why there's a lot of effort by the WHO to elevate antimicrobial resistance to a global problem, to have global coordination, as we also see with climate change, right? So you can have very good climate change policies in your country, but it is a global problem. And antimicrobial resistance is a little bit like that. It's not quite, I mean, bacteria, they don't travel as well as CO2 emissions.
They can put up guards at the borders.
Yeah, we've seen that. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
I think I already derailed you from what you were going to explain, why it's important to make the distinction between slow onset disasters and faster ones. And I presume it's largely that you're looking at the political reactions, that how politicians respond to these issues, right? And the dynamics of getting public or political will generated for action must be quite different, as we already know from. I've been working on nuclear weapons for 45 years, and getting almost nowhere. But with the COVID thing, people, and especially climate change, the persistence of denial or ignorance is really discouraging for anybody trying to mobilize action.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's true. Of course, me being a political scientist, that is the sort of characteristics I see with slow onset disasters, that it's more difficult to sort of put on the political agenda, and not only put on the political agenda, but also keep on the political agenda. So we saw, for instance, with climate change, that we had an opening in the 90s, Kyoto Protocol, and there was this big push, but it's so difficult to sort of keep it on the political agenda as well when other issues emerge. Even sort of well-meaning politicians, it's very hard for them to look 30 years ahead. And if they look 30 years ahead, then it's also very cost-free for them to say, well, in 2050, we are going to be carbon neutral, for instance, right? Because they know they're not going to be put accountable for that sort of more loose promise. But you can say that slow onset disasters in other disciplines also have distinct properties. For instance, in sociology, people experience slow onset disasters differently, of course, than rapid onset disasters. And your analogy again to the boiling frog is very correct, right? That if you throw the frog in the boiling water, it'll jump up again, like, and scream, which would be a rapid onset disaster, such as a sudden earthquake or something like that. If you boil it very slowly, it'll still, it'll still die, but it'll die in another way, right? It wouldn't sort of notice it in the same way. And you can say a lot of people.
This is like a parable or something. I don't know whether it's true. Has anybody actually experimented by trying to boil frogs? And
well, the French probably.
That's true.
I just read that actually lobsters were sentient now, and this is a recent article, not to derail the discussion, that it's we should not boil them because they're sentient, so we needed to kill them first and not just put them in boiling water. But that's another.
That kills them very quickly anyway, doesn't it?
That's what I thought, but I don't know why. If we talk about famine or recurrent flooding, like flooding that happens all the time, part of it has to do with that they're poor and they don't have the means to move. But another part is actually also that you get used to this recurrent disaster, this recurrent drought that always happens. Mm-hmm. It's just a way of life.
One of the things that worries me is that we can't get enough news coverage of slow-moving disasters. It seems to me that certainly trying to get the newspaper to write about nuclear weapons, or even news about nuclear weapons, such as the treaty that is supposedly banning nuclear weapons, didn't get any attention. They don't bother to cover it. And now I don't understand that, the lack of public awareness of it, but as a demand for news, probably present stories that they think people want to hear, and people don't want to hear about something that's not so urgent, or it doesn't seem so urgent. Is that part of your bailiwick, studying the dynamics of how to get attention focused on these issues?
Yes. So yeah, that is part of. So I'm not sort of a communication specialist or sort of media specialist, but that is part of the picture. Now, it's not clear cut because, for instance, a good counterexample to what you described would be climate change, right? Where there's really been a lot of attention to climate change. It's really been picked up in the media, even though it's definitely a slow onset disaster. So the question, of course, becomes, why do certain slow onset disasters, nuclear proliferation, antimicrobial resistance, and others hardly get any coverage, while others get a lot of coverage? For instance, climate change. Mm-hmm. And not just coverage, it's sort of really ingrained in the minds of especially young people with climate change. When I ask in my class, what is the number one concern, I also think that when research institutes ask, even during COVID, like climate change was up there as one of the primary concerns. It's not obvious that climate change is an environmental issue. It might as well, when it came out, it might as well have been an energy issue or a transportation issue, right? It could be, but it was sort of, it came out, in the wake of cars on Silent Springs and the huge upsurge in environmental movements. So it already had this infrastructure when it came out, and was sort of very quickly adopted by these huge NGOs, environmental NGOs. And I think that's part of the reason, because if you contrast, for instance, with let's say, nuclear proliferation, or in my case, antimicrobial resistance, it's very much siloed in health or military studies, right? Like antimicrobial resistance is really sort of a sort of health issue. It doesn't have a broad base. We don't have an antimicrobial resistant Thunberg, the Thunberg, the activist, Swedish activist. It's mainly sort of health professionals. I guess the same is the case with. I haven't researched that a lot, but with nuclear proliferation, that this is a military issue. Those who cover it are either sort of, at least today, maybe there was more of a movement in the 60s and 70s. I remember, at least with nuclear power plants, there was this public movement of getting rid of those. But with nuclear weapons, it's very sort of, I think, technocratic or sort of military, and I think that's part of the reason why some slow onset disasters get much more attention than others, and it's not necessarily related to the severity of disasters of the crisis, right? Because
that's an interesting insight. I would agree with you that because I've often been puzzled. We live in a pretty good democracy, and something like 80% of the population on polls will say they would like to see nuclear disarmament, complete abolition of nuclear weapons worldwide. People would say that, well, a little less in some countries, but a majority in all countries have at some point or said, yes, they would like to have nuclear disarmament, but they don't show it when it comes to voting. It doesn't become an issue. We just had an election here a few months ago in Canada. There was no discussion of military policy really at all. And I think it's because people would say, yes, in an ideal world, it'd be nice if we could have nuclear disarmament. But who am I to say what's realistic? It's military, generals and so on who really know.
I agree with you on that. Right. So I guess sort of a political issue can both be top driven or bottom up driven. Right. I mean, you can have sort of grassroots movements that say this is important. Right. BLM movements, for instance, or that can sort of set the agenda, or you can have it some politicians who want to set the agenda doing something. Right. And you're right. I mean, there's not really a pressure, even though like 80% might say that they would want to have total disarmament of nuclear weapons. They're not really sort of pushing politicians, at least not in Europe. I don't know about it in Canada, right? So
no, they certainly aren't anywhere, as far as I know.
No, exactly right. Yeah, it's not a salient issue at all.
But right? During the 80s, you do contrast it because that's when I got involved. I've been doing this all my life, it feels like. And during the 80s, there was a sense that, my God, in just a few weeks, they're going to be installing these Pershings and these other ICBMs, and Europe is going to be 5 minutes apart. And we just have a limited amount of time in which to get in there and block this. And people did have a sense of there was a time frame at which time it might be too late to intervene. And so we had a million people who would go out onto the street. I was one of them. And in Toronto here, we had probably 15 or 20 meetings per week in different church basements and so on of people working against this threat because there was a sense of great urgency. And of course, Gorbachev and Reagan met in Iceland, and they said, now they've handled it. But of course, they really hadn't handled it, and it's still there. But there was a sense of it's over now. The time frame is changed. Yeah.
And that's part of the problem with slow onset disasters, that you might have windows of opportunity, as you had maybe in the 80s, as you have with climate change in the 90s, but these windows close again. They might open again, right? But the windows close. You can't sort of keep. It's very, very difficult to keep slow onset disasters on the political agenda for a prolonged period of time. And the dilemma is you need, in order to address these issues, which are all complex issues, you actually need to have it on the political agenda for a very long time. So you maybe with nuclear disarmament, it can be solved with the stroke of a pen, like, okay, let's agree. But with climate change and antimicrobial resistance, it demands continuous policies throughout a lot of years in order to sort of rectify the problem and reduce the problem. And so that's very difficult to do. So you might get these stents in certain periods of time where, there's the focus, but it's so hard to keep.
But even in a case where a stroke of the pen might do it, and Gorbachev and Reagan came very close to doing it in Iceland. But, always there are behind the scenes, I can name the people who were whispering in Gorbachev's ear. And pressuring Reagan and so on. So this thing was going on as an impulse to force them in that direction. It wasn't just an automatic decision on their part to certainly reform and come to Jesus.
Yeah, no, that's true. And with, I guess, with nuclear weapons, I mean, that we all have this with these transboundary threats or crises, that sort of collective action problem and the free riding problem and the lack of transparency, right? And with climate change, it's like, okay, so I don't have to do anything if all other countries are doing anything, or why should I do something when China's not doing the same? And that's of course an issue. I guess with nuclear weapons, the stakes are just raised a lot, right? So if I disarm and suddenly the Soviet Union does not do it, and we can't really see what they're doing, and maybe they hit somewhere and so on. So of course the stakes are much higher with nuclear weapons than with climate change. But essentially the problem is the same with these transboundary threats, and that's a question of collective action problem. Harding's theory of tragedy of the commons, and all these sort of different coordination problems on the global level that also
so you mentioned a couple of things about that I think could be worth exploring further. The fact that, for example, nuclear weapons are considered the province of the military experts. And but now there are other threats that sort of have that same property. I'm thinking, for example, we started Project Save the World before COVID hit. And at the time, people were thinking, you're including pandemics? Well, pandemics are not going to happen. That's not our problem. People were a little surprised that we included pandemics as one of the major threats to humankind. It's not surprising anymore to anybody, but there is still one quality about it that at that time, I was having the idea that what we would be doing is trying to get NGO leaders to get together, and people in different silos, different specialties, different threats should see how much their threats were interdependent and should start interacting more and making this into a common cause, some sort of comprehensive package of solutions that would all fit together. And but it was hard to get people in the field of pandemics because they're only medical professionals,
Exactly.
Public health experts are in charge and have always been in charge, and you don't get public NGOs to be engaged with that. And as far as I know, that's still the case even now that COVID has come, and we would hope soon be gone, that the public doesn't feel that it's their business to organize independently as in church basements and agitate for any particular intervention. And I don't know how to combat that.
That's true. So as you rightly said, I'm a disaster researcher. So I've looked at disasters for the last 15, 20 years. So for the last 5 years, I focused on, and that was also before COVID-19, I focused on health emergencies, starting with the H1N1 pandemic in 2009, and then looking at antimicrobial resistance, and now, of course, COVID-19. And what struck me was the difficulty of integrating social science with public health or medical science. So I was used to, like in all the other areas, like development studies or first responders after an earthquake and so on, there was this appreciation of social science. It was very, very easy to sort of come in and do these interdisciplinary groups, but it's been very, very difficult with these health issues because they're sort of siloed in these medical experts, and the medical experts are really clever, and they have a lot of knowledge, and they know that they have a lot of knowledge. Mm-hmm. So it's and sometimes they call their field for science. Like what they do is science. And I said, well, social science is also science, I guess, right? I mean, it's really difficult to get access. And when I did get access, it was often in the sense that, oh, but you can be used to communicate the findings we have to politicians. You're a political scientist, right? So you can communicate the findings to the politicians. You understand that? And I say, well, no. I mean, if I was good at that, I would be a lobbyist. I mean, and earn twice what I earn now, or three times what I earn now. So I want to analyze things just as you do, just using different methods and different sort of theories. And but I think they're opening up a lot now, and I've tried to sort of, but it is an uphill battle, and it's also not only their fault, it's also our own fault, social scientists, because, and I guess Meta, you know the same, that my DNA is being sort of, it's not solution based as such. I don't sort of look for solutions when I do research necessarily. It's more, critical analysis of things, and that's interesting in by itself. Whereas, of course, medical experts or public health, they're always focused on finding solutions, right? That is their sort of DNA. So imagine if you went to the doctor and they said, well, there's this and this wrong with you. And then they just stopped and you said, well, what's the solution, right? That's what they have to do. So we also have to be better at saying, okay, so, I mean, ideally, that's not sort of in our DNA, but we have to move. If we want to work together, we have to move a little bit in this direction. And, the medical health expert also have to appreciate our contributions as well. And I think it works. In Europe, we have this center for coordinating. It's called the European Center for Disease Prevention. And so I'm part of some research groups there and some consultancies there where we look at COVID-19 and the decision making that took place in some countries from a social science perspective, right? So I think they're opening up. The anti-vaxxers, also great. Like, it's not about only communication. You need to dig deeper if you want to find out.
See, I have been on the other side. I have been much more interested in finding solutions, policy proposals. As a rule, I was a founder and I started and ran a program in peace and conflict studies at my campus of the University of Toronto. And I got people from all these different disciplines teaching these different fields to put whatever topics they were covering. If they were history of civil wars, then that course could count toward the program. You could get a degree, a BA in peace and conflict studies. But the one department that wouldn't play in my new aggregate was political science. And they said, we want to be, advocacy is out. They didn't like finding solutions and proposing solutions. And that still is, I think, a big barrier to doing the kind of research that I would like to say I do. Because there is kind of a sense that you have to be very careful about not looking like you're trying to organize a social movement on campus and then carry it out someplace else. And I've found that to be a significant barrier. I didn't think of it particularly in connection with diseases or pandemics, because I hadn't done that kind of work. But it obviously is relevant to what you just said, that maybe there has to be some kind of compromise. Now, about 20 or 15 years or so ago, at least, there was a move in that direction by a sociologist named Michael Borawoy, who in his presidential address to the American Sociological Association advocated what he called public sociology. And I didn't know what that was. In fact, there hadn't been any such thing. And what he meant was people like me, do the kind of work I do, and which was very gratifying at the moment. I don't know that it's caught on, but that would be the kind of move that would help to erase the differences between people who want to be, I don't want to call it value neutral. What's a polite way of describing what you've just attributed to your own discipline?
No, I do want to say that the university I come from, Roskilde University, we are famous for activist research. Okay. But it is, of course, research can't be value neutral, but I think it's more to do with that when I do research, even famine research, I mean, I do come up with that I analyzed, as you very well know, that like whether democracies, the extent to which democracies can protect against famine, right?
Oh yes,
But that, yeah, yeah,
Amartya
yeah,
Sen and Jean
yeah,
Drey
exactly, yeah,
here.
yeah. But that is, I mean, so the policy description for that, I mean, it's not like, oh, okay, if that was the case, then you could say, well, then every country needs to be a democracy because then we would protect against famine. So there's not sort of a clear-cut policy conclusion from that. It's just an academic interest, and of course also an interest in trying to improve the world. But it can't be translated into concrete policy recommendations, sort of at the more meso or micro level.
I
So
would.
even
I would
yeah,
grab
but
your findings and run with it. But
yeah, okay, but you see the point. So let's say that we found, which I didn't find, but let's say I found that democracies, was the best protector against famine, right? I mean, you can say, well, I found out that this was the case, but you can't ask, Russia or or China. Okay, you need to be democratic because that's the best way to protect. I mean, there's not sort of a tangible policy recommendation in that. So it's more on the sort of aggregate academic level. So that would be an example of research that might be interesting, but it's not, you can't sort of concretely say what is the value or the concrete policy recommendations. I mean, I'm very rarely, I've never been involved in sort of a patent, for instance, which is something that medical scientists would often be involved in.
Sorry?
A patent? Patent,
yeah,
or I don't know.
How could you?
I mean, no, exactly. But that is the sort of but this is what they're much more concrete or much more. Yeah.
In fact, that's one of the things they put on their CV. How many patents?
Exactly, and I can put a big zero on mine. But yeah, okay. But you're right. Like I like the term public sociology. Yeah. I really like that.
Now let's talk about this anti-vax thing, because I am just absolutely fascinated by this phenomenon. I simply don't get it. And you must have been reading that literature. There must be people in psychology or social psychology, as well as in political science, explaining why this is happening. And what I don't understand also is why it's right-wing people who do it. I don't get any logical connection between right-wing politics and fear of vaccines. But there must be some explanation for it. What is your best notion?
Yeah, so I have to sort of preempt this by saying this is not my research area at all, right? But this is just like what. So I guess, and when we talk about right wing, I guess it's usually in the context of the U.S. and Canada that right wing.
No, it's not just there, because consider Bolsonaro, for example. I mean, he's a right wing. He's a wannabe Trump kind of guy.
Sure,
isn't he? And he's the one who said, "Oh, don't worry about viruses." So I guess it's worldwide that the right wing. Maybe not.
Yeah,
maybe not in Russia, because come to think of it, the people I know in Russia say that the rate of vaccination is very, very low. Most people won't get vaccinated, but it's because they don't trust the government. Well, exactly. I don't know whether it's because they don't trust the government because it's not right-wing enough or not progressive enough.
No, I think it's trust the government, period. And I think like right-wing voters or the population that are right-wing are, they have this natural inclination to not trust the government. The Second Amendment and the right to bear arms and all that. That is a sort of a concrete manifestation of a distrust in government, whether it being right or left. Right? It's liberty over the common good, you can say. Right. At least in the U.S. And that's why I want to, because in my parts of the world, in Scandinavia or something, being right wing is slightly different than being right wing in the U.S.
How so?
Yeah. So I mean, so being right wing in Scandinavia is almost democratic. I mean, the right wing in the US is so far right. I mean, we don't have any sort of inclination, or right wing people do not want to bear arms, or they don't want to topple the
Okay, but
government.
something like a right-wing movement, for example, in Norway now, that guy who, shot a bunch of people, or, one of these mass murder things, is part of some sort of kind of a Nazi-like
Sure.
movement that actually has some political representation, doesn't it? No,
No, no.
no.
I
There's
mean,
nobody really that right-wing in all of Norway.
I wouldn't. I mean, of course, you can find Nazis everywhere, but not as a political party.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't call right-wing people in the US Nazis as well. I just want to be clear. I'm
No,
just
no,
saying that.
no. I
So
have a friend. No,
yeah,
look, I have a friend, Arlie Hochschild, who's going out and living with these guys around, was it
exactly.
Charlottesville or
Yeah,
Charlottetown or
yeah.
something, where they had that big demonstration. And
But yeah,
those folks are real Nazis,
yeah. Oh, they are okay. But I'm just saying, like, being pro life. You don't find right wing people in Denmark being pro life, or what you say, like against abortions. That it's
Now,
not really
why?
religion.
What's the connection?
But
Logically.
no, but I'm just saying the right wing movement in the U.S. I mean, mostly they're pro life, they're religious. Many of them.
Right.
That they like to bear arms, and none of these traits are really strong with the right wing movement in Scandinavia. The right wing
But there
movement in
must be
Scandinavia.
people anti-abortionists in Scandinavia too, aren't there?
When you say there are people, of course there are people, but they're not represented in the parliament.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's not a political movement. Of course you can find people who thinks all, but it's so ingrained in the DNA of the citizens there that you don't find any sort of pro-life representation in parliament. Yeah. But anyway, so what I wanted to say about the right-wing movement and anti in a lot of Scandinavia, it's immigrants who are not vaccinated, right? So I think yeah. So to the same degree as the right as the rest of the population. So I think a lot of this comes down to trust, as we also said with the right-wing movement in the US. They don't have the same level of trust to at the government, whether it's Trump or Biden. And the same is also true for immigrants and migrants, that they don't have the same trust to the Danish systems as sort of the majority population has. So trust is something that is fairly a fairly big predictor of vaccine.
This anti-science movement seems to me that it isn't just they don't trust the government, but there's a move in the direction of not trusting elites, meaning probably you and me. They don't probably trust us as much as they would have 20 or 30 years ago. But in particular, they don't trust scientists. And that's, I don't know where that comes from, and I don't know why it would be correlated with not trusting the government, or why it would be any particular party. Why would anti-scientists vote Republican, let's say?
So we're really far out from where I have my expertise, like American politics. So yeah. I want to stress that. So I guess so. I think the anti-science has always been there, but in Denmark we have the HPV vaccines. Like you vaccinate young girls for artery cancer, like in
yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there you also had like a lot of people were doubting the vaccines, and I don't know whether my daughter should have the vaccine, because of course so we're hardwired to be much more susceptible to to concrete stories or narratives. I mean, we have a hard time processing big data. So when somebody comes and tells us, well, there are side effects, but it only hits 1 out of 10,000 or something like that. But it's very interesting that we all know somebody who had a side effect, right? I mean, because the story, the narrative keeps going, and oh, but my daughter got this vaccine and she felt very ill, and so this is anecdotal evidence, and we are all very susceptible to anecdotal evidence, and we have a hard time processing, statistical information, and also risk in terms of statistical information is very difficult for the human brain because we are looking for sort of more digestible, you can say, information that we're used to. So we are not used to dealing with, that is another thing, we're not used to dealing with risks such as this one. When we were Neanderthals, or not Neanderthals, in the Stone Age, I mean, we would just die if we had a virus, right? We would be much more sort of alert to the tiger or the lion, or so these are concrete manifestations of risks, right? But it's much more difficult with a risk that you can't look, you can't see it, you can't smell it. It's not the sense. I mean, you can't use your senses. You have to use your brain. Of course, you can see if people get ill and die, of course, but you can't sort of. It's the same with climate change. You can see the manifestations, but you can't see climate change. You can't see the COVID-19. You can see the repercussions. You can see people getting ill, but you can't see it, right? I mean, it's not a bear attacking a lot of people or something like that. And that, I don't know why it's more right-wing people that in the US at least that tend to distrust science, but I don't think it's a new phenomenon. I think it's been there for a long time, but it's just surfaced now because COVID-19 is there. And also with COVID-19, I think that the scientists, some of the scientists or health experts, they haven't made it easier on themselves, if you can say it like that. So, so if you had this notion of medical science as an infallible discipline, then it's been sort of proven wrong by COVID-19, right? Because it's a new pandemic, and it was really, really difficult, especially in the beginning, to wrap your head around it, even for I would say especially for health experts, because they were constantly trying to model the virus on something they knew, like is it behaving like the regular flu, influenza? Is it behaving like SARS? Oh no, it's something new. But and there was no evidence. I mean, we didn't have a lot of scientific evidence on how effective is mask wearing, how effective is it to social distancing. There weren't a lot of studies actually. I mean, they exploded now because of COVID-19, which then introduced a whole other problem of actually sort of seething through this humongous volume of scientific, non-peer-reviewed, some peer-reviewed, publications. So, and I think also, without knowing, I think at the beginning, the health agencies, the CDC in the US went out and said, well, you don't need masks and so on. And it was not because, it was actually because they didn't have enough masks, and they wanted to make sure.
There's a guilt thing. I think that was kind of morally wrong, because they knew better. They knew what
exactly
that they were deceiving people for their own purposes.
Exactly.
And that is, I think, really reprehensible and has backfired on them, because people, you needed masks, and it didn't take much to figure that a mask would do something for you anyway.
No, of course not. Yeah. And
but
then also,
I mean, some of it was also just not knowing whether it was transmitted by air or by touch, because for maybe 3 months or more, whenever anything was delivered to my apartment, I put it on the kitchen sink and I sprayed it with Lysol and alcohol and things like that, and I left it 2 days before I would touch it. Because I was afraid that the contact would do it. I didn't know anybody who does that sort of thing anymore. Because we think, well, you're going to get
mostly airborne. Yeah. But I think you can still get it by touching, but it's mostly airborne, right?
Yeah.
But there's so many things we still really don't know about it. Like let's say like for a month ago, you had projections from the Danish health authorities that we would have maybe 1,000 maximum. They had this huge spectrum where it's maximum 3,600. That was the absolute maximum we would have in November, and now we're at 4,400. So it's still, I mean, it's so difficult to predict by the health experts, and of course it's not because they're incompetent or anything. It's just because it's actually, and this is one of my points about evidence-based decision making, is that it where we need it the most is when this happens. But unfortunately, this is also where evidence is most fragile, right? When we have a new crisis, a new pandemic, this is where we need evidence-based decision making the most. But unfortunately, evidence-based decision making is also very fragile because of uncertainties, because of high stakes, because of the time pressure, because of political interference, and that is also, I think you will agree with this point, social science has been sort of sidelined a lot during the COVID-19, even though you had a lot of these non-pharmaceutical interventions in the beginning, but still it was sort of very much a problem of virologists or epidemiologists that sort of ran with this, and it's understandable at some level, but I mean, I would like to see more social science integrated into these sort of into evidence, you can say. Yeah.
One of our threats is cyber risks. There's a lot of concern about the fact that, for example, Facebook tracks our purchases and knows too much about us and things like that. But there are many other threats that are cyber risk issues that I don't see how to organize the public in a way that would be impactful. How I don't know of organizations. I think there's one or two NGOs trying to work against various kinds of cyber risks, probably mostly phishing and that kind of hacking and that kind of thing. But the major threats to companies, or where one country now tries to deliberately create sabotage in another country's what was it, pipeline or something, they can do huge damage and so on. But sure. I'm really, as an activist, trying to figure out how to mobilize the public on these issues and get some sort of coordinated action, but I haven't a clue how to do it, or what we would, where would we go? What would we ask for? To whom would we petition?
Yeah, no, that's true. I really like this discussion because you take me to a lot of unfamiliar places. So cybersecurity is one, or cyber risk is one, and how to mobilize. I actually think that you know much more about that than I do. So
no, I don't. I wish I did, because that's what I try to do with my life, and I'm not very good at it.
Well, I beg to differ, but no, I get your point that there are certain. Again, we're returning to the thing that there are certain things that are just easier to mobilize around, and cybersecurity or cyber risks are probably not one of them. That's true, but it's also. So I'm trying. So what would be the mobilizing idea? Because I mean, a lot. I mean, if you say cyber risk, I guess it's not Facebook that are sort of stealing our data.
Well, that's not what worries me. I don't really care if Facebook knows where I go, but I can see why some people would. But I don't think that is the worst threat. I think when the Russians, and it was certainly the Russians, tried to derail the U.S. election, and maybe I don't know, they may have actually been significant in getting Trump elected. I don't know. That is serious when you have one country, and also disinformation campaigns where they use something like Facebook to whip up animosity between ethnic populations in a country
Sure.
and
Sure.
make trouble. That
Yeah.
kind of deliberate political, mischief is, I think, way more serious than these people who try to bilk me, with these
Sure.
emails.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's true. But I guess information is because I don't know what you would like people to mobilize around, because I guess there are nobody who thinks it's a good idea to that the Russians meddled in the election, except maybe Trump. But I mean, so I don't see why it demands this grassroots mobilization. I mean, I guess it's more, for me, it would be a state matter. If a foreign state intervened in an election, it would be sort of a state matter. It wouldn't be sort of a grassroots mobilizing. For me, like as a political scientist, I would say that's more, like it's the same if you're caught a spy, or you have this, I would say that's more of a state matter. Of if they attack the pipelines, I would also say that's a state matter, security matter. I don't see but what I'm trying to understand is what I mean. Why would you mobilize people against it? Because I think most people are against it. And what would be the
what? Stop it. For example, one of my friends is a former ambassador for disarmament. He's working on. The UN has had processes going on for several years, an open-ended working group and some other different processes going on, trying to create some sort of agreement, some international treaty that would then ban certain kinds of troublemaking activity, either interfering with other people's elections or shutting off their electric grid or something, which is also a possibility. But then, of course, then the question is, how far down the scale of triviality would you want to go? Would you want Putin to be responsible for making sure that there's nobody trying from St. Petersburg trying to get money out of my bank account? I don't. I don't know how all these phishing level hacking misdemeanors would fit in there. But the main thing is they're not getting anywhere, because I would love to say a treaty would handle it, and then we might have some enforcement mechanism. I don't even know how you do that, but it's something that we need it, and to demand it, I think. To ask for it is the first step in trying to get it. Maybe we can organize to try to expect it. I don't know what it has to look like, or whether it's possible to make one that's effective. I don't know. You have to have some real expertise.
Yes. And I think but it's the same like the enforcement. That's the problem, right? I mean, it's difficult to enforce, and it's also difficult to be transparent. So even with the Russian meddling in the election, it's not clear whether it was coordinated by Putin. I mean, you think it is, but it's you don't have the smoking gun. I mean, he could say, well, I didn't know it was just 10 independent hackers that just happened to be in Russia. Mm-hmm. And now I don't know a lot about security, but I think cybersecurity, I think you can sort of you can conceal where you are, and you can have you can go back doors from other countries and attack. I guess So it's much more it's much more difficult to monitor vis-a-vis a nuclear deal, for instance, I think, right? This
also, kind of I interviewed a guy named Bruce Schneier at Harvard who deals with this kind of thing. But I mean, the simple explanation is that in this area at this moment in time, defense is a lot harder than offense. Anybody in the cyber mischief business can get away with it, because it's so hard to catch them and to punish them and so on. Now, apparently that's not inevitably going to be the case forever, but at the present, and I don't know whether he has any inside scoop on how one could improve the level of defense against this kind of thing. But as of now, that's the reason I get 5 or 6 a day, is because nobody ever catches these guys.
No, exactly.
For little petty stuff.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. That's another slow onset crisis, maybe cyber risks. Yeah.
Well, what is your next project? What are you going to be working on next?
Well, I have my plate full with COVID-19 and antimicrobial resistance. So I'm trying to, because there's been this huge explosion of COVID-19 research. So I'm trying to keep my focus on antimicrobial resistance, which I think in the long run might be as big a threat as, if not a bigger threat than pandemics. We don't need to sort of compare, of course, like that. But I do have a lot of work with trying to figure out how evidence was used in the decision-making process during COVID-19 responses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of evidence was it? So not just look how politicians acted, which would be my inclinations as a political scientist to do, but also to look how was evidence collected, interpreted. We had a lot of different health agencies, and the same evidence resulted in different recommendations in the same context, right? So, there is so much interesting going on just at the, health agency, health expert, bureaucratic level that I think I'll focus on this first step, you can say, in the decision-making process. How was evidence collected? How was it interpreted? How was it sort of made explicit? And of course, I have this notion that we need more social science as part of evidence by itself, not just as a means of communicating evidence and getting it to politicians, but as part of evidence.
On antimicrobial resistance, and she told me something interesting. It's Laura Kahn, who's written on this subject, and
I know her.
Do you know her? Oh,
she's writing a chapter in a book I'm editing at Oxford University Press. Yeah.
Well, she pointed out something I hadn't known, which is that that when you feed it to animals and they pee or poo, this antibiotics gets into the soil and it changes the ecology of the microbes in the soil in ways that we don't understand and probably don't want.
Yeah.
Is this being addressed?
I guess then she also talked about the One Health perspective, right?
That's one of our. The reason I got to her is we have two planks in our platform for survival that have to do with pandemics. One of them is promoting One Health, and the other one is promoting something called incident management or something like that. And that's a method of. I can't even find the word I want to use for it, but it's a way of organizing your response teams, the firemen, the ambulances, the whatever. All these organizations, you have to structure them in advance and prepare them for various new roles that they might take under various things. So those are the two planks in our platform. And we certainly focus a lot on One Health.
Yeah. No, but that's true. I don't want to. I mean, Laura Kahn is an expert in this and a medical professional and so on and scholar. So I don't want to sort of interfere with or try to outdo her with that. I have no idea. I just know that is the case. That you have to. When you feed it to animals, it also goes into the drinking water, of course, and all that, right? So that's a complex problem. But I'm more looking at it as a global coordination problem, and there's a lot to be done on the global level as well. Like
this has been extremely interesting and valuable. I'd love to. Let's do it again sometime. Okay.
Yeah, let's do that. And thanks for having me on.
Thank you. It's been fun. Take care.
Yeah,
bye.
You too.